welcome back to Young Adult Adventist. I'm Chandler Coleman, and we thank you, whether you're listening on whatever you're listening on. If you're watching on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whatever podcast platform you're listening on, we are glad to have you. And I'm pretty excited today because this is an episode with someone that we've been trying to get going for a long time now, and I'm super excited. And so Jonathan is here, and I'm going to have, I kind of just said your name, but I'm going to ask you kind of who are you? And where you're going to school now, and maybe kind of your spiritual journey over the last couple of years. So Jonathan, if you could tell us a little about that.
Yes, I'm really, really excited to be here. Actually, it has been a long time coming. We talked about this for a little bit. I'm here actually a student at Southern Adventist University here in Tennessee, and I'm a theology student. And I'm really excited. The topic we're talking about today, I'm not going to share it yet. I won't spoil it, but it's really just kind of an example of the experience I've had. I've grown up in the church, but it wasn't until I really got to know Jesus more and read about how he is truly my friend and my savior that it kind of changed everything and has led me to this point here. And I'm just excited just to talk about Jesus, man.
Yeah, and so maybe just one more thing about you. Where did you grow up, and maybe what did you do this summer?
Yes, so I grew up in Southern California. I'm from Southern California, love it, born and raised, and I've been there, and I'm from a little small town near the border called El Centro, and I've been there basically my whole life in the desert. And this summer has been my fifth summer of literature evangelism. I like canvassing, and so I've been there and loving it, going door to door, talking about Jesus. So that's what I've been doing these past summers.
That's awesome. As you can see, a pretty amazing person sitting across from me, so I'm glad to have him. And yeah, for episode 12, the title of the episode is Coming Back Home, a title inspired by Jonathan, definitely not last second. But the story we're going to be looking at is the prodigal son. And see, most of the podcast episodes we've done in the past have kind of just been over a general topic and not over a general story. And so I'm really excited to really just dig into this story and really see how it applies to our life, because there is so much application we can take out of the story. And so the first question I kind of have for you, you've kind of alluded to it a little already, but why did you want to choose this topic? Why did you want to choose this story?
Man, that's for sure a question I've asked myself as well. When I look at this story, I think this story really just represents my life, whether it be, just in my past, how I dealt with God, how I felt about God, and how God has felt about me. And I think this past year, this has been the story of my life especially. And I've learned that there may have been some misconceptions I had about God, and I needed to reread this. As popular of a story as it is, it really did hit home for me, I think, this past year. So that's why I've been loving to talk about this story, I should say.
Yes, awesome. Like you mentioned, a very, very powerful story. And I feel like, especially for someone that's grown up in the church, I feel like a lot of people that grow up in the church are like, where's my powerful testimony? It's because you've grown in the church, you've gone through all these things, and it's like you don't feel like you have that amazing, crazy, come to God testimony that other people may have. But I feel like this story perfectly depicts how our testimony and other people's testimonies, even though there's not this great, come to God moment, how beautiful this story is and how beautifully this story can represent us even when we grow up in the church. And so what we're going to do, we're going to read, start just the first few verses 11 through 16. We're going to read here, and then I have a few questions after that. And so I can just read the first few verses, and then maybe when we read again, you can take the next ones. But okay, so starting in verse 11 of Luke chapter 15, if you want to follow along watching here, it says, Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything." And so these first few verses, again, a very famous story. We've all kind of know what's going on here. But a question I have off that is, in what ways in our lives can we act like the prodigal son at the beginning of this story?
And I think when you go to this topic, it's very interesting how we act like this, being like the son being representing us and the father representing God in this story. I feel that sometimes we're very ungrateful for what we have, and we don't take the blessings, you know, like we take them for granted, basically. I remember reading this story and seeing that I remember I said it represents God, the Father being God and us being the Son. And I thought to myself, what blessings has God given to me, that I looked at them and just said, like, okay, whatever, thank you. And just never had a relationship with him, just wanted him for what he could do for me. And I think that's what ways we could be a prodigal. Sometimes we just look for God for the good things he could give us, and never just the actual relationship of spending time with him.
Yes. And there's that quote that says, you don't truly realize what you have until you lose it. And I feel like for me, that's something I've been realizing just a lot lately. It's, you know, as you grow up, as you get older, to be like late high school or maybe early college age, you start to realize some of these things that you took for granted, even just in middle school and high school when you were younger. It's like there's so many things that we didn't really care for, but we realize now that they were such great blessings. And so I think a huge thing with the prodigal son, if he would have just realized that, like so many of us don't realize that, hey, so many of these things are blessings, and think about it in the way that if they were taken away, how hurt would you be? How much would you want those things back? And I feel like sometimes we need to check in with our lives like that, because we don't, especially when it comes to getting deeper here, maybe family members or friends. It's like we might treat them good, but then all of a sudden they're gone, they leave, they die, they move away. And it's like, man, I wish I would have done more for them. I wish I could have been more of a friend, been a better family member to them. And it's like we don't truly realize all these things until they're gone, or until something drastic happens. And it's like, it doesn't have to be like that. We should be able to change our mindset.
I think I agree with that. I think that we'll see that even later on in the story, how that applies, and especially how, like, we never, like you said, never know how much something is worth until you lose it. And as I was studying this, going back to that, going deeper to those first verses, in verse 12, when I talked about, the son asking for the father to give him his portions, I thought about, like, in Jewish traditions, at this time, how the oldest would get the most of the portion. But then I started to ask myself, why is he asking for it? When does he usually get his portion? And I started to realize and read and understand that, the sons would get their portions of the inheritance when the father was dead. And so speaking about this and thinking about this, I started to think, like, maybe am I just, Jesus being on that cross, dying for me. Maybe I'm just like, okay, Jesus, you could die for me. I just wanted the good for you. Like, can you just die real quick so I could get these blessings? And I just think, at what point, like, how am I treating God in my life? Am I treating him like this parable, this prodigal son, I should say? Yeah,
that's so good. And now we get to kind of get more into the meat of the story. And so, Jonathan, if you could read verses 17 through 24, that good chunk of the story.
For sure. It says, "But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' And he arose and came to his father. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. And bring the fatted calf here and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to be merry."
Wow. I mean, that's just, no matter how many times you've read it, such a powerful story. And so kind of going back to the beginning of these verses, I have a question. When do you think the prodigal son truly started to regret leaving his father? When did he first start to realize what he had done?
I feel like if we're putting ourselves in the position, I feel he always knew that he was doing something wrong.
Wow.
He was just so stubborn that he couldn't want to admit it. I think when he saw the food, that's my opinion, that when he saw the food, he knew he hit rock bottom.
Yeah.
And he couldn't do it by himself anymore.
It's like it's just crazy to me that, again, going back to the point where we can have so much, and then, like you said, I feel like he was even blind to the fact that he knew he was doing wrong the whole time. But I feel like sometimes deep down we can know we're doing wrong, but we're so good at justifying everything that even though deep down we know we are doing wrong, we justify it and justify it and justify it until an actual consequence comes. And then we're like, oh, now I need to change. It's like we know it's a problem all the way. It's bothering our conscience all the way through. But then until an actual problem or consequence comes, then we realize, oh, shoot, maybe I shouldn't have done that now, even though we knew it was wrong all along.
I agree. I really think that when you're in this space, you know what you're doing wrong, but you don't want to admit it. The pride just hits too much. And I believe the prodigal son here, representing us, it shows that the pride was getting to him, that he couldn't really give it up, give up what he was doing. Yeah.
And you mentioned that you feel like he started to truly understand and regret it, like once he saw the food, once he saw the pig's food and realized he had nothing left. And that's just crazy to me if that's true, because he had how did he not realize? It's like you could tell that also he wasn't as responsible. And I think there's a lesson in this too, that, hey, if you're going to go do something different, if you're going to go do something new, you got to be responsible, because he was squandering his money and spending money. He probably didn't even realize that he was nearing rock bottom of his savings. And that was probably a pretty penny worth of savings that he was spending. Yeah. And so I'm sure that was a pretty decent amount of money. So he had to be doing a lot of crazy things, pretty close together to be able to get all that money down. And so it's just crazy that it shows where his heart was, shows where his mind was, that he wasn't really focused on anything else except for material possessions of the world. And it's crazy how much those things can make us feel good in the short term, and how much we just push away the long-term consequences when we're focusing on all these short-term things. And then once again, we get to the consequence, and then we realize, man, maybe I shouldn't have done that, when truly deep down we knew it was wrong the whole time.
Exactly. I feel like you were hitting it on point, especially because it shows where his heart was, like you said, that he just wanted that instant gratification. And sometimes we just want that instant gratification, even though we know what we're doing is so wrong, but for the moment, it feels good. And I think going off of feelings has been really something that's led the prodigal son to just do the wrong things and go closer, farther away from God. And I really believe you see that he really hits rock bottom here. He's, especially in Jewish customs, the pigs were just the filthiest of the filthiest, and they eat anything, trash, anything. So the point where he's thinking that is that's what he wants to eat. He for sure has hit rock bottom. And I think about it in my own life. I've been at that place, where you hit rock bottom, you don't know what to do, and anything else besides what you're doing looks better than where you're at right now in life.
And I can even relate that to when you sin, it's when you sin, and the Bible tells us in multiple verses, and we even know in our own hearts that when we sin and when we're at our weakest, that is when God calls us to come back to him. And it's when we sin and we fall, it's that the last thing we want to do is come to Jesus. And we'll try to do all these other little things, all these other things to where anything but be able to talk to God about my sin, because we feel so guilty inside. And it's crazy how a lot of that hasn't really changed for me. It's I'll say that, I'll be man, I really need to come to God in my guilt, and I'll be doing good, and then I'll really start stumbling with this sin that I've been trying to get better, and then all of a sudden it's back to the same thing where I'm oh man, I can't even go to God right now. And then you wallow in that guilt. You're trying to find pleasure, trying to distract yourself from all these other little things, and we do all these other little things except go to God. And it seems like that's what the prodigal son was doing. He was doing all these other things except for going back to his father, even though he knew that was the right thing to do, but he felt so guilty about it.
Yes, I think that was such a beautiful point. Honestly, I think about that, and I think about just our life in general, think about how God feels about us. Like we were saying, I was saying, this is where I really started to see what God was trying to say, how God really was towards me. And I think the devil really likes us to believe the lies of how God really feels about us, and he likes to twist it around. The conviction that this prodigal son felt is good, and even though he went through a lot, the father was trying to get his attention the whole time. But Satan is here telling him, maybe you're too gone, maybe you're too far gone, and instead of the guilt, there's shame. There's guilt, which is the conviction, but then the devil adds an extra one. He says, no, you didn't just do wrong. You are wrong. You can't go back. You can't come back. Why even try? And I think that's something I struggle with so much, that when I saw that, I started to think in my own life, I've been convicted, but have I stayed in that because I've been shameful of what I've done and felt like I couldn't come back.
Wow, that's so awesome. And just going back to the point where, again, you said that he really started to realize it once he saw the pig's food. And it's crazy to me, because he ran out of money well before that time. And so it just makes me think, of the point, just like the prodigal son, how oftentimes do we think we're invincible? Like even when we hit rock bottom, even when we realize there's nothing left, we still think we can do it out of our own power. And then again, once the consequences come, then we start to panic. Then we start to be like, oh God, help me now. It's like we can hit rock bottom. All the things can be showing us like, hey, this is the wrong way to go. But we still feel invincible. We still feel we can do it out of our own power. And it seems like going to God is our last resort. And for the prodigal son, that's what it was. Going to his father, as sad as it sounds, was the last resort because he didn't want to go back. He didn't want to go back and experience the guilt and the shame. And so, I'm not going to, actually, I regress. I'm not going to spoil the rest of the story we're going to say, but it's so amazing, the parallel that we're the same way. We will do anything not to come back to God. And yet, even though God knows our hearts, God knows that a lot of times when we come to him, we're just coming to him because he's the last resort. And yet he still chooses to love us, still chooses to pursue us, still chooses to forgive us, even though a lot of the time when we come to him, it's out of a bad heart posture. It's out of a heart posture that it shouldn't be because we're coming to him just as the last resort, just because we have nothing else. And yet God still chooses to pursue us, still chooses to love us and give us what we need in this situation.
That's so beautiful, especially the fact that you said that it's a last resort, even though we know, and like the prodigal son knew it should be the first resort. And I think about that when I think about that point. I think about the first verse in verse 12 when he asked in the beginning to give him the inheritance. And I mentioned it before how that's like he gets the inheritance when the father dies. So he's basically just asking for his father to die just to get that. But the beautiful thing, like you were saying, even with the bad intention, even when he just wanted to go party and do his own thing, the father still gives him the inheritance. And that just shows the character of God. God, knowing how wrong of the intentions that we have, still gives us the blessings because he wants to reach us. Like you said, he's pursuing us even when we don't have the right heart and the right mindset. I think that's just so beautiful. And again, it just goes back to share how much we have a misconception sometimes of how God is. He gave him the inheritance knowing he just wanted him to die.
Wow, that's crazy. And I think moving on to this next question is just going to add to how powerful the story is. And the next question is, how does the father embracing his son relate to God embracing us when we come back from neglecting him?
Man, I think for this one, whenever I've read it, I've never thought about the fact that the father ran.
Wow.
This father is a rich man.
Yeah, he didn't hesitate. He wasn't like, oh, I don't know, how is he going to react? He ran without any second thought.
He ran without any second thought. And back in those customs in the day where Jesus is talking about, rich men did not run. You know, there were two. They never ran. You never find any rich man running. And so it just lets me know like God doesn't care about the norms, doesn't care about how other people think, what other people will think of him. He just has his eyes on me, and he just wants to pursue me. And the beautiful thing that I would never forget about this story is the fact of, I always ask myself the question, how did the father know when the son was coming back? And the thing is, he didn't know. He was waiting outside the house, waiting for him to come, waiting for him to make the first step. And I think that will never leave my heart, that God is just waiting for us to come back home. And that's where you get the title, you know?
Yep.
Yeah.
That's crazy. And it just, it reminds me that like, yeah, this, like you said, the father had no idea when the son was coming back home. And it reminds me of the beginning of the story that the father proved at the beginning of the story that his son meant a lot more to him than his money did. And he was going to let his son do whatever he wanted. And then it's truly brought to light at the end of the story when, again, you said it's not the custom because the father's rich. He's like, he can't be running. And again, that doesn't mean anything to him when he sees his son running, when he sees that his son on that road and he starts running to him. And just like you said, that's how God pursues us. When God sees that we're coming back home, when God sees that we come to him to repent after our sins, when God sees that we come back to him after we've neglected him after a hard time, or even if we've been faithful to God and God still rejoices every single time we come to him. And it just shows that when we decide to be in God's presence, God puts everything else aside. Nothing else mattered to that father at that time. When he saw his son, nothing, it doesn't matter what could have been going on, nothing else mattered. And it just, how amazing of a reminder is that we're the same way. When we come into prayer with God, he sets everything aside. nothing else matters to him, and we are his sole focus when we pray to him too. That's pretty cool to think about.
That's so beautiful. I've never heard that thought, and that's a very beautiful thought. We're the sole focus on God's heart, especially in this story. And it really just goes back to share of how he feels about us. And I think you see that very clearly and very deeply through this story. And so just a little point that I thought of when going a little bit back to the story of him being in those feeding the pigs and stuff. I think about that when I was trying to learn more about the character of God and the misconceptions. I started to think about, we hit rock bottom just like this son. We're supposed to here to represent him. And then I started to think to myself, do I think the father wanted to see his son where he was at? So many times we go through trials in our life and we had to hit rock bottom. And for this son, just like it could be us, he was too stubborn to see that he could do it he could do it his own way. He thought he could do it his own way, but he couldn't. And God knows that. But it hurts God to see us having to go through plans B through C to do our own thing. When he's plan A and it works perfectly fine with plan A, but he has to allow it, and it hurts him to see that. And so I think it goes to show that even when we're trying to go to God and we're trying to do our own thing, it hurts him to see that, but he knows it's necessary to get our attention, to let us know like we need him. And he's just waiting waiting for us to come back home when we're doing our own things, living our own lives. And I think it's very beautiful.
Wow, that is so powerful and so good. And I feel like this next question is going to kind of go off what we've kind of been talking about over here over the last little bit. And it's something that everyone truly struggles with to one extent or the other. And it's kind of off the last question, but it says, why is it so tough to go to God after we have sinned?
I think we were talking about it earlier. I think first of all, I think sometimes we don't want to admit that we're wrong.
Yeah.
That's the pride, and it's very relatable. But I think sometimes we misrepresent or misunderstand the difference between conviction and guilt, I should say, and shame. I believe, conviction, guilt is something that God does. It's the Holy Spirit telling us that we've sinned and we could go to God, but shame is there given by the devil that we can't come. We have this misconception that we've done too wrong. And sometimes we feel like the prodigal son, we hit rock bottom. There's no need. How can God really help me when I'm messed up this much? He doesn't know. I've been going back to the sin, back and forth, not realizing that I shouldn't be doing this. Sometimes we know what we're doing is wrong, but I believe we just never know. We never think we could come back. We just misunderstand those two and confuse those two things.
Yeah. And kind of off that, one of the quotes that has genuinely changed my walk with God the most, and it's just that the closer you are to God, the more shameful you're going to feel. And that's just, it's not all that like lovey-dovey of a quote, like all that. It's not all like rainbows and butterflies, but it's so true that the closer you are to God, God is going to bring forth and show you more sin you are that's going on in your life. Because there was a long period of time, like early in high school in my life, where I would be reading the Bible so much every day. I would feel so good about myself, but I would not be praying to God. I would not be talking to God. I would not be asking God to change my life. So I was reading the Bible thinking I was doing all this stuff good, but in reality, I was filthy inside and I didn't even realize it. Wow. And in Christianity, that's the most dangerous thing. When you're filthy, and everyone's filthy, but when you don't realize it and you think you're doing good by just reading the scriptures. I mean, there's a verse in James that it's so powerful. It says, you believe that there is a God? Good. Even the demons believe there is a God and they shudder. And so that was just crazy when I read that. It's like, man, if I'm just reading the Bible, and like we've talked about this in class at Southern too, it's like one of the greatest theologians of all time was the devil and still is the devil because he studies the Bible. And so it's like, man, if I'm just studying the Bible and not applying it at all to my life, I am no better than a demon. That's crazy to think about, but it's true. And when I finally realized that, I was like, man, I've got to get my life together. And now it's like over the last few years, I realize how truly filthy I am. And it's hard. It's hard to realize. It's hard to accept that. But when you truly accept that, that's when the growth can come, and that's when your ultimate peace and the satisfaction can come in Christ, because you start to realize your filthiness, all this stuff, and you start to get better at it. And it's such an amazing process to see God work through your life to make you a better person when you truly acknowledge that you were filthy to begin with.
That's beautiful. I think that when we realize that, you're saying, it changes everything. It really changes everything when you realize it. And I think the prodigal son, his life changed, when we read it already, but this life changed when he gave his life, he came back home. And I think the same thing can happen for us. We don't realize the beauty that could happen when we come to God and give our lives to him. And I think realizing that we are filthy. We are really unrighteous. We are very sinful. We have done wrong. The story doesn't end there. And I think that's where most people fall short, and they don't come back to God because they think that's where the story ends. They're convinced that the story ends when they fall, and they just realize that. But there's a God waiting for us to come home. And I think when we realize that, we realize he's there with open arms waiting to run towards us. I think that will change the perspective we have when we sin.
Yeah, the story is so beautiful as we keep on alluding to it. And let's go ahead and finish out reading this. So Jonathan, if you could finish out reading, I think verses 25 through 32 is the last verses of the story.
Perfect. It says, "Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, 'Your brother has come, and because he has received him safe and sound, your father has killed the fatted calf.' But he was angry and would not go in. Therefore his father came out and pleaded with him. So he answered and said to his father, 'Lo, these many years I have been serving you. I have never transgressed your commandment at any time, and yet you never gave me a young goat that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as this son of yours came, who has devoured your livelihood with harlots, you killed the fatted calf for him.' And he said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that I have is yours. It was right that we should make merry and be glad, for your brother was dead and is alive again, and was lost and is found.'"
Wow. And yeah, just a quick question after reading all this. So the beginning of these verses, it brings a dilemma. It's like a great story to this point. The father's embracing him, and then it brings up another little kind of a point in the story. So why might so we know the prodigal son, but why might the other brother be one of the most important characters to focus on in this story?
I think that we could be both sons in this story. We have our experience with God, or we come to God and have experience of getting to know him and getting embraced by him. And we have such a powerful testimony. But then we get jealous of when others who are maybe more sinful than you, according to your standards, when they try to come and they live their own lives and now they're trying to come back, you're acting like the prodigal son's brother and thinking maybe they don't deserve it, even though we never did in the first place.
Wow, that's you actually just skipped ahead to the point I was going to make later. But that's just so true, and I'm just going to go ahead to say the point I was going to make later because it kind of directly ties in. But it was just, you were saying we so often put ourselves in the story as the prodigal son, and rightfully so. I mean, that's beautiful. We all can relate to that. We're all sinful. We all go away from God, and when we come back, it's like God embraces us so much. But this story can be just as applicable from the fact that we've got to make sure that on the other side of the spectrum, that we are acting like the father in the story and not the brother. Because as simple as that sounds, it's like, oh, of course we should act like the father and not be jealous like the brother. But how many times in your life, and not even thinking about the big situations here, but just the small situations. Like you might hear about one of your friends that you've been a little bit jealous of in the past, and they might have got this great opportunity or something like that. And all of a sudden it's like you aren't embracing them, you aren't congratulating them like the father, but instead, even if you're not gossiping to anyone else, you are still holding that resentment in your heart, just like the brother did. Wow. And so it's like, just as much as this story is applicable to us being the prodigal son and coming back to God, and that's amazing, and we've touched a lot on that, but at the same time, when other people are going through their revelations in life, when it's people that we might not be too fond of, when it's people that maybe have done us wrong, are we acting like the father, or are we acting like the brother?
That's exactly it. That's the question to ask. Who are we acting like? Are we acting like the father? How we genuinely should as Christians. You know, I think about it a lot. I've had a lot of friends in ministry, and I've done ministry for a few years of my life since I've been, converted, and I've loved every single moment of it, and I'm appreciative of it. And I've caught myself so many times in ministry, my friends having these big ministry opportunities, and maybe they've been in ministry a little less than me, and I'm just in my head like, I'm grateful for their experience, but where's my experience? Where's my opportunity? Yeah. We tend to not. Sometimes it can hold them back. and it can hold them back from doing it if we're not as excited and as encouraged. And I've had him, sadly, I've had many experiences where people have seen my feelings throughout my face. I show my feelings on my face, and they see that I'm a little unhappy, and it discourages people. And I think it really holds people back from not getting embraced, but just staying in that place and never growing as a Christian. And I think once we get past that prodigal son phase and we're in the brother phase, we don't have to act like that. We're called to, 1 Thessalonians tells us to uplift each other as we are doing. And I think sometimes I've caught myself, and many times, doing the opposite, just like the brother.
Wow. And the sad part of it is, and I can't speak for other churches, but I know the Adventist church right now, there's a lot of people that, and I mean, that's every church in general, but there seems like there's like the Christian church in general, but it just seems like there's a lot of people that are just being pushed away, and maybe even a lot of people you wouldn't expect that are all of a sudden, they've been there for a while, and then all of a sudden they're just completely pushed away from the church. And it just reminds me that so many of us Christians are talkers, but we talk the talk, but we don't like to walk the walk. We'll preach the story about the prodigal son in our sermons. We'll preach it in church. We'll be like, wow, this is God. This is the gospel. And all that's great. But then after the sermon, after Sabbath, throughout the rest of the week, we don't really follow it up.
Wow.
And instead of when the prodigal son is preaching a sermon and those people are really intrigued and trying to get closer to God, and they may come to us for help or come to their church for help, and it just seems like they're getting rejected, and it's more of like the church seems like the jealous brother. They don't want anyone coming up and taking their positions.
Wow.
They don't want anyone coming up into their church and messing up what they're doing, or even anything along those lines. And it's just like, us as humans, we are so selfish, whether we realize it or not. We could be so involved in the church, so involved in ministry, so involved with anything working for God. And we say it's for God, but in all reality, we could be so selfish. And it begs the question, like the certain positions we have, the things that we're doing, if God took that away from us, would we have lost our purpose? If he took that away from us? Whereas if we've worked at these things, and if God is our purpose, even if he takes those things away, yes, it might be sad at the beginning, but we'll be content because God is our purpose. Wow. And it can be crazy deceiving that the devil could even use things such as working for the church or things like that and then we can idolize those things, and those things can become our purpose. And then if those things become taken away, or people start seeing problems with those things, it's like we have our identity in that, so we can't let it go when our purpose should truly be with God.
Wow, exactly. I think when it begs the question, where is your heart when you do things? Or, the prodigal son was just shocked probably at this moment that he was even received with not just received, but received with such love. And I believe many Christians come, and you see people come into the church and they're just on fire for God. There's this young person or older person, whatever it may be, they're on fire. They want to help out the church. And then some people get hurt because they're scared of losing their position, when in reality, that's the goal. Everyone is here to help. Everyone is here to do ministry. And then you ask yourself, where is your heart? Can I serve God wherever I go, or does it have to be in this church position? Am I holding anyone back? I think to my own life, am I holding anyone back in the positions I've been able to have for ministry, whether at churches, whether in my ministry and canvassing, like all these things I've been blessed to have in different positions. But am I happy and content wherever I am at, or only when God gives me these big opportunities? It's something to ask myself as well. Yeah,
and like just what you said at the very beginning, that's been something that has been one of my main focuses over the last just few days, because I've realized, man, I want to find the joy of Christianity again. I want to find the joy of following Jesus again. And I feel like some of the time why I've been robbed of that is simply because my heart posture has not been in the right place. And that's just meaning that I've been so focused on all the things I've gotten, and I'm like, man, these things are good, and I need to work my best in all these things, and I'm just focusing so much on doing my best, and I'm doing good for others, and not necessarily in a selfish way trying to impress others, but just idolizing, trying to do my best in everything, and not truly relying on God's strength. Wow. And I'm more relying on myself to carry me through rather than God to carry me through. And it's so easy to say, trust in God, let Jesus take the wheel, and we hear that all the time, and we may once we hear that, we may do it for a little bit, but then we're like, man, I don't really like this that much. This is God. This is my life. This isn't this is my life, and I can throw God in the side. Exactly. I don't want God taking my whole life. And just relating it back to the story with the prodigal son. I mean, when the son was away from his father, he realized he had nothing. And how much is that the same when we're with God? Like we mentioned at the very beginning, we take so many things for granted. But then when we find ourselves distant from God, we realize that we are truly nothing and we can't help ourselves at all without God.
Wow. I think it really goes to show how much help we really need when it comes to our hearts, because just like the problem of the prodigal son, of him being down in the dumps, feeding the pigs, he needed the father's embrace. And I believe the beautiful thing is that though sometimes we need to learn that humility lesson of letting everyone just grow in Christ, whether in ministry or anything like that, the father is still there for the brother, even in his own way of thinking.
Yes.
Because the prodigal son was at that point when he left with a bad intention. And we see also that, like the story tells you, like it says in verse 29, where the prodigal son's brother speaks of everything he has done for the father.
Wow.
So there's both.
Wow. How much do we do that to God?
Exactly.
We speak of everything we've done and we're like, why is this person ahead of schedule than me? Why is this person getting all these things and I'm not? And we start listing off all these things that we've done for God. And then God's like, hey, since when was that ever what it's about?
Exactly. It's never been about that. It's been about the relationship with him. He's like, and he literally tells him, everything that I have is yours. You've been home. And I really take this, sometimes the home that I think of is sometimes I think about it as church, like this prodigal son started in the church, and I related to myself, growing up in the church, and he was instructed well. There was nothing wrong with how he was instructed, but out of his own decisions, he leaves. And the prodigal son's brother, who was there in the church, maybe living his own life, doing all these things, and maybe in real life, when someone comes and they're on fire for God, they've gone away, but they're coming back. The person who stayed there thinks that they're more worthy because they've never left. And at the end of the day, leave or no leave, the Father still loves you the same.
Wow.
No one is loved more in this story. There's just a lesson that this prodigal son's brother needs to learn. And I think it's something that I really like to think about, is where the Father's love is shown, obviously, for the prodigal son. But we have to know that the prodigal son's brother has the same love. And that's what he tells him. My love is still there for you. Everything that I have is still yours. But just understand, don't keep others away from receiving the same thing that you've always had. And I think it's a beautiful lesson I've gotten.
Wow, that's crazy how true that is, that from one end of the spectrum, we preach to everyone, hey, it doesn't matter how far you go down in the dumps, how far you go down, God is always going to love you just the same. But then we take it from the opposite perspective, and it's like the people that are coming back and they've started in the church, like you said, and gone away from the church, or just whatever situation, they were like closer with God and now they're not close with God, and then they came back to God. It's like all of a sudden, now that's not true because we're in the equation, because we have a sense of entitlement that, this person left and came back, and God, I stayed loyal to you. And now we have a sense of entitlement that says, man, God, why are they getting treated the same as me, when that's literally the gospel we're preaching to everyone else, saying, hey, doesn't matter where you go, doesn't matter how far you go down, you can come back and God will welcome you. But then when we're in the equation, someone gets brought back, and when it affects us, all of a sudden it's like, God, what's going on? I've stayed faithful to you. I've worked for you. And yet I'm getting treated the same as everyone else. Where's my status? Where's me getting elevated? And we might not say those things directly, but deep down, that's what we're thinking, and how like our human nature is so selfish. And if we don't pray to God on a daily basis, asking him to rid us of that sinful nature, it can really eat away at us without us even knowing.
And that's a beautiful thing, because it goes to share and to show that we need God, that there's a daily necessity of him.
Yes.
Because this is the genuine thought of our hearts, that whatever affects us, we don't like. And whatever doesn't affect us, we could care less about. As we say, if it doesn't affect us, preach, whatever you've done, no matter what you've done, it's okay. Just come to Jesus. He'll embrace you, all these things. But if it affects us now, if it's like, he's taking my position, as we go back to that illustration, it says, if you're taking my position, maybe like just learn a little bit more before you're in my position. And I believe it just goes on to say, like the phrase I always say, like, just check your heart. Probably God's just saying, check your heart, come to me, let me soften your heart, let me, be humbled, to know that God needs all of us, and God wants all of us.
Wow. Such a beautiful story. And we could probably make so many different illustrations on the story. But to close out, I'm just going to read the very last verse, because it's just so beautiful. I love this verse so much. And it's chapter 15, verse 32. And it says, "But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. he was lost and is found. And it's just such a great reminder that this is what happens when we're lost in our sin, when we're lost in this world, and when we come back to God. No matter what situation it is, when we come back, the angels and God aren't judging us like we so often think they are. We hear all the time, all throughout our childhood, that God embraces us when we come back to him. But yet, once we deal with our sin, we're deep in shame. We feel like we feel like we've let God down, and we feel like when we come to God, God is judging us, and his angels are even judging us. And yet, once again, we're preaching to everyone else that God celebrates. And we see in this verse that God celebrates you when you come back to him. After when you're in guilt, when you're in your shame, when you're in the depths of your sin, you feel like nothing can help you overcome this. When you come to God in those situations, that is when heaven rejoices the most, because you are against all adversity and you still chose to come to God through faith. And it just shows that, wow, like there's nothing we can do. There's nothing we can do that'll separate us from God. It's just that example of a parent with their child, like the child like saying, "Oh, mom, if I did this, would you not love me?" And the mom's like, "I'll still love you." The child's like, they go through all these things, and the mom's still like, "I'll still love you." And it makes sense. And yet when it comes to God, we so often forget that no matter what we do, and even if we don't come back to him, if we wander, all feeding the pig, squandering our money like even the son did, even if we do that, and God again is our last resort, God's still going to accept us with open arms just as much as any other situation, because he just loves us that much.
That's so beautiful. And if it's okay to share a verse, that's
absolutely. Absolutely.
This is kind of the one that kind of inspired the where I come from.
Okay.
And it's in John 6:37. This is my favorite verse, or one of my favorite verses, especially for this one. And it says, 6:37, John 6:37, all that the Father gives me will come to me. And in my favorite part, it says, and the one who comes to me, I will by no means cast out. I think when I think of the story, something that I've never thought about till reading it a few months ago, is that the Father was outside waiting for him. And he says, the verse tells us that the Son was afar off. And that's what made the Father run. When I think about this verse, God, when we come to him, will never leave us, never forsake us when we come to him. And sometimes we think in life that coming to God means I need to meet him halfway.
Wow.
But all God is asking for us is to make that first step, and just like
he'll come running to us.
And he'll come running straight to you. So wherever anyone's at, even to myself, it just takes the first step. You don't need to make yourself better of a person. You don't you don't need to come with your speech like the prodigal son did, You just need to take the first step, and he's there. And I think that the daily decision will never let you down. He'll still go there. That's just the last thing I wanted to leave off of.
Yeah, that's all God requires of us, is just to take the first step, and he'll run to us with open arms. How beautiful is that? Well, thank you, Jonathan, for coming to this episode. I mean, even just in the midst of this episode, doing this episode, this was even a little emotional for me and blessed me, because, man, this is just so relatable in so many ways, and such a beautiful story. And even some of the points I made, I haven't even thought of before. Some of the points that I heard you make, I've never thought of before. It's just such a beautiful story, perfectly depicting how God loves us. And so thank you, Jonathan, again for being on this podcast. I would love and I hope to have you back on soon, because it was just an amazing episode to have you. And I hope you guys enjoyed the episodes. Let us know in the comments, or just let us know personally or separately if you enjoyed this episode, because I know I was definitely touched by it, even though I'm involved in it. I guess that's a little biased. But thank you again for tuning in, for wherever or whenever you're tuning in. We thank you. And thank you, Jonathan, for being willing to be a guest.
Again.
Yes, loved it. Loved every second of it. And go ahead. I would recommend just read the story on your own. Read the story of the prodigal son. Meditate on it. Pray about it. And because I know I definitely need to do that, because even going through this story touched me so much. And I can only imagine in your personal time in prayer how much more God will reveal to us and reveal to you if you study his word. So thank you again for tuning in. Thank you, Jonathan. And we'll see you again on the next episode.